Each year, I am struck by the power and insight of the Yom Kippur ritual we reread in the Torah's reading today. The potential for holiness as a collective is made possible by the annual rite of communal confession. Through the process of tshuva, of admitting our faults as individuals, as families, as branches of the Jewish people, and as the entire house of Israel, we conduct the rite by placing our confessed, verbalized sins onto two blameless goats, one sacrificed for God and one that is sent free into the wilderness. We promise for a different behavior in the coming year, and we begin that behavior free of the defense mechanisms of denial, repression, transference, projection. We place our al-Qates onto the blameless goat and allow it, in William Tisdale's famous translation, to escape, thus taking our confession with it. As the theorist René Girard explains, a collective atonement ritual is meant to help us address how we are complicit in the inequities within our society. Exactly the content of the Haftarah the rabbis chose for Yom Kippur. And by confessing collective guilt, we avoid the human tendency that if you don't do so, tendency to form a conspiracy theory that a particular group is to blame for the inequity we experience, which will naturally lead to violence against that group because that's what scapegoating is. A society projecting its own sins onto a blameless scapegoat group. It traps the psychic energy of Azazel, and rather than dispelling the demonic, makes a home for it. Has there been a people so often scapegoated as the Jewish people? Has there ever been so much projection of other sins onto us? My wife tells me that at her conversion Beit Din, what she remembers most was not the half hour of banter, answering questions about Judaism with the rabbis. She got them all right, by the way, none wrong. Wasn't holding the Torah for the very first time, getting a blessing. It was asked when she would stand and answer the following question: do you truly understand that you are joining a persecuted people? And while the present moment may be a time of extraordinary acceptance and safety for the Jewish people, history tells us that such times are short-lived for you, but especially for your descendants. Did we expect this to be happening in America in our lifetimes? Did we expect each day to contain an unexpected surprise in our professional organizations, in our neighborhoods, in our social media groups, in our public schools, on our school boards? I never know behind what door a surprise will jump out. Showing up for an academic lecture and finding the presenter argue that Judaism is responsible for the history of, and I learned this word from them, the history of exploitationism of the natural resources of the earth. Because, why? How'd that happen? The Torah got rid of the nature gods of the surrounding indigenous cultures. Does it matter that the Torah personifies the earth and attributes to her actual legal rights? Or the nearly 2,000 years of active Jewish mysticism, which sees nature itself as made of God? They were asked this question. Well, they identify as a person of a marginalized group, so they are just not interested in what white male rabbis had to say, so they're not going to study it. And no evidence that other cultures were less exploitationist isn't relevant. If they had nature gods, they represent indigenous wisdom, and that's good. But Judaism is not indigenous, and that's bad, because it's settler colonial institution that chased away the indigenous gods. And so QED, they caused the destruction of the environment. I think we're getting blamed for climate change. Or when I spoke with a friend of a former doctoral candidate. Former, because when they asked permission to do their research on Israel, we're told that it's not a problem, as long as they take an anti-Zionist approach. Or when I started reading a new anthology of scholarly essays on the ancient world, and started reading one that claimed that Jews invented capitalism and exploitationism, based on just a few verses of the Bible. I wondered how scholars can make such historical arguments without any historical evidence, so I looked the scholar up. He declares himself a Marxist on his website, and he reads everything through a Marxist lens. And so that makes it okay. We have a word for these kinds of readings in Judaism. They're called midrash. Midrash is when you say, this year, I want to view this story through a particular lens to see what insights this might reveal. Midrash are imaginative readings to see where they take us, sometimes to make a very strong ethical point. But they are not scholarly readings, nor do they claim to be historically accurate. We don't say at the end, this is the only right way to read this, or it's the true meaning of the story. We have more humility than that. When I spent 5 years grading undergraduate papers for the faculty at Stanford, I would not have allowed such statements to go unchallenged without proper evidence from an undergraduate. Midrash gives you permission to see the lens you're looking through in the text. Scholarship demands that you discover something other than your lens. I really love reading the indigenous wisdom of the book, say, Braiding Sweetgrass. I think it has a lot to teach us. It inspires me. I don't think you need to blame the Jews for the destruction of the world's environment to say so. And I don't think you need to say that Jews are incapable of indigeneity and indigenous wisdom. You know the expression, if all you have is a hammer, everything starts looking like a nail, even when it's not. Today's hammers are all of these terms that get capitalized: Marxism, postmodernism, indigenousness, settler colonialism, genocide. These are the new gods. And like the prophets warned us, false gods usually are pretty two-dimensional and don't seem capable of doing the work attributed to them, but people worship them nonetheless. And somehow they always lead to making Israel or the Jews the scapegoat for the world's problems. When the members of a society cannot process their own guilt, find a way toward rectifying inequities, they will project their own sins onto the scapegoat. Maybe this is why so many of our young people are so assured of Israel's sins. Could it be that from the time they are young, they are taught that they are living on land stolen from indigenous tribes through settler colonialism and genocide, heirs and beneficiaries of a society steeped in structural racism, inheriting an environment poisoned by capitalism and extractionism, and the truth is a social construction, and it's their only scaffold for understanding the world. And so much of that applies to America. We load it all on them, but we don't show them the means for tshuva, for helping to heal this society and moving forward. What are they supposed to do besides being suspicious of every older adult? Refuse to work for a company because it makes a profit? Drop out of a university because it teaches on stolen land? Refuse money they inherited to pay for their education? All they can do is what the peoples of the world have always done: project those sins onto the Jewish people. Doesn't matter if it doesn't fit. Reason plays no parts in the projections of the psyche. Allows the blamer to be blameless. We've replaced God with ideology. We've replaced the sanctity the holiness code calls for today with sanctimony. Sometimes it's so obvious, I'm thunderstruck. Like when I stood at one of the city council meetings and watched as the 100 or so activists next to me giggled and guffawed when a speaker mentioned the atrocities of October 7th. They screamed, "That was all made up by Zionists. None of it is true. You're the baby killers. There was no attack. There are no hostages. There is no terrorism. It's all made up by the Jews in order to take Palestinian lives." How many of the hecklers carried signs that said "Jewish Voice for Peace," whose Instagram post last week was, "Death to Israel is not just a threat, it is a moral imperative, and the only acceptable solution, may the entire colony burn to the ground for good." But Israel is the one who has genocide in its heart. Genocide is another one of the labels that every city council, every student government must include in their resolutions, or the resolutions aren't acceptable. How about a resolution that calls for divestment from arms manufacturers because too many civilians are dying in this war. I may not vote for it, but that's not anti-Semitic. Or a resolution that calls for an immediate two-state solution and the return of the hostages, I'd vote for that one. But that's not acceptable without the words genocide or war crimes. The gods will not be satisfied unless their names are mentioned. And the only solution is not two states, but violence against the scapegoat. Do you know where an actual genocide is taking place today? It's in Sudan, where the RSF has taken over most of Darfur by using sexual violence, mass killings, and systematic destruction of villages based solely on ethnic criteria. The RSF, who murdered an estimated 300,000 people in the early 2000s, and now another 20 to 150,000 in the past year, since October 7th, are Arab. And they murder anyone who is non-Arab, whom they refer to as dirt dogs and monkeys. They are armed with advanced weaponry mainly from the United Arab Emirates. Last year, the United Arab Emirates was the 6th largest receiver of US military arms exports. Israel was 9th. Where are the calls of student leaders to divest from the UAE to stop the genocide in Sudan? And I don't blame, and neither should we, all Arabs for the conduct of the RSF. If anyone wants to harass an Arab in Ann Arbor because of what's happening in Sudan, I will stand in front of them and defend them. Or at the very least, Israel's supposed to admit the sin of settler colonialism against an indigenous population. Does it matter that historians agree that the Jewish people are indigenous to the land of Israel? They were called the Hebrews. Yes, even though Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob all lived there and made their settlements there and existed there, Abraham did say he migrated originally from Ur Kasdim to Canaan. But so did every other peoples who had lived in the land at that time, between about 1500 and 1750 BCE, each tracing their roots to migrations from elsewhere, except maybe the Canaanites. Philistines from the Aegean Islands, the Hittites, and I'm just going to use the present-day designations. Hittites, what's Turkey today, Ammonites and Moabites from Jordan, the Midianites from south of there, Amorites from present-day Syria, the Hebrews, likely from the Aramean area. So maybe the Palestinians are the Canaanites, Koch and Nadav. Yasser Arafat used to bristle at that suggestion. He argued the Palestinians were proud Arabs, meaning they come from Arabia. We are not your American Indians, he chided. Today, Palestinian activists have seized on claiming that they are indigenous Canaanites because they have found it influential with Western sympathizers. If anyone's interested in the science, it was published in the journal Cell in 2020. Genetic studies determined that Jews and Palestinian Arabs both share about half their DNA with the Canaanites. We're either both indigenous or we're not. And why are we having this conversation? Is it just an academic accident that this indigeneity criterion, a product of American guilt for its own genocides, is applied to Jews as scapegoats? Could it be related, just maybe, to the anti-Semitic tropes used by Hitler, that the Jews were an invasive species in Europe, needed to be exterminated, and could never have the deep connections to the land that ran through indigenous Aryan blood? Cue the Wagner. Actually, at the turn of the century, Palestinian Arabs acknowledged that the land had been a Jewish state until the Romans massacred the majority of the Jewish population, almost 2 million Jews, within a century, and enslaved or expelled the rest. The important argument to them was not that they have the right to the land because they were indigenous, but they have a right to the land because they defeated the Byzantines in war later, when the Jews were already gone. As Yusuf Daya al-Khalidi famously said, Zionism is in itself only natural, beautiful, and just. Who can contest the rights of the Jews in Palestine? My God, historically, it is your country. But then made the argument, unfortunately for the Jews, history has intervened since, and war has a way of changing entitlement. an argument that is unacceptable when Jews make it today. You know that further complicating this whole settler colonialism thing is that a huge percentage of the Jewish population of Palestine, about 600,000 Mizrahi and Sephardi Jews between 1950 and 52, came not from a devious plot to settle the land, but was the consequence of Arab countries expelling their Jews as a punishment for the 1948 war. It wasn't settler colonialism that sent Jews to Israel. It was literally the Arab nations themselves. As I talked to another of our college students, they told me they just think the Jewish state is wrong because no state should have a dominant religious group. But since when did our young people want to take on the guilt of all these accusations against us? I tried to point out that like Jonathan Sachs, over 40 countries are by law Muslim, only one Jewish. And how about when the British created Israel and Palestine? One to be majority Jewish and the other to be majority Arab, saying those who have homes in the other one, they can stay or they can go. They also created India, Pakistan. One Hindu, one majority Muslim. Said if you want to stay and be a minority, you can stay, you can go to the other one. They left it up to the minority populations to decide whether to move homes or not. Where are the demands to divest from Pakistan, from India, as illegitimate states? And then one of the students I was talking to said, please stop. What I really need from you more than anything is something that fosters dialogue, not division. There is a way forward. It came to me spontaneously 5 weeks after October 7th when I was in a daze and I was supposed to be one of four speakers at the annual Interfaith Thanksgiving service of Ann Arbor. 2 of the 4 speakers mysteriously dropped out. That left me and a Baptist minister. In the crowded church, the Baptist minister walked up and said, I'm a Christian, so I don't believe in labels like terrorist. Martin Luther King was called a terrorist. Jesus was called a terrorist. And walked off. I didn't know what to do. And I said, my heart breaks for the Palestinian people. Maybe we all have a part to play in our story, but they have been used and abused. They have been left as refugees, in many ways homeless, broken, and thoroughly demoralized by the plans of surrounding nations and by their leaders. And they need to be heard, they need to be cared for, and this world needs to help them. But it needs to come at a price of giving up the idea that the gods of progressive ideology are our religion. They need to stay separate. I didn't know how it would be received, so I walked off. Nearly every Muslim in that room, students included, came up and hugged me. One of them, who's fairly prominent local civic leader, said to me, if I knew you existed, maybe I wouldn't be moving. I'm leaving Ann Arbor. How many of our Jewish families have said that? So here is the way we move forward, to dialogue and not to division. It's not going to be easy. First, even if we lose friends, we need to refuse to engage with these projections of Western intellectual labels. They are false gods. By engaging with them, we only give them power. That also means not engaging with the militant activists who follow our leaders around to their homes and their offices, banging drums, screaming in the faces of people in the Student Senate for casting a vote. Second, saying that what makes the accusations wrong is that they're anti-Semitic, that will not get us anywhere. It just plays into the same divisive paradigm. As one recent University of Michigan graduate told me, we just have to convince the other side that despite being invited into whiteness, we Jews are an oppressed entity too. A competition for who is more oppressed, and so who is entitled to protection, just plays into the whole flattening of human beings into binaries. What makes the accusations wrong is that they aren't true, not that we are a protected class. What makes it wrong to harass a Jew on a college campus because of events in Israel isn't anti-Semitism, it's the harassment. It would be the same if someone harassed a Chinese student because of China's actions. Third, we need to give up our ideologies as the lens through which to see other human beings. The lenses that I mentioned earlier have illuminated deep aspects of the structural racism and divisions in our society made possible by our hates, our unconscious sins. But I think we've leaned so heavily into the social constructedness of everything that we've lost sight of real people. Real Israelis who live within sight of a Hezbollah army of highly trained soldiers holding an arsenal of modern armaments and missiles, whose stated mission is our struggle will end only when the entity of Israel is obliterated. People remember them killing 200 United States Marines. Real Palestinian Arabs, real people whose homes have been destroyed, family members killed, hope shattered. Real students who are screamed at as cowardly baby killers and genocidal Zionists because they cast a vote in the Student Senate. It's strange that often the extremists who accuse others of dehumanization, when it's actually a classic case of where Pirkei Avot calls, you see a flaw in another that is actually the one that you possess. To say it's a conflict of identities erases the true pain, the pain that is shared. We need to be seeing everybody's humanity, listening to their pain, letting them change us, and through the interaction of soul and soul, letting us change them. It's to have the faith that God gave us the power to connect with any human being without having to use a lens we were taught. A true relation is not between its, Martin Buber taught, but between thous. I don't want to create a Palestinian state in the West Bank and Gaza to make atonement for the sins of settler colonialism. I want to do it because human beings who happen to be Palestinian are crying out to be able to raise their children without fear of them dying by the hands of Jews or of Hamas. And finally, I will not use the sins of others as an excuse not to do the work of the Yom Kippur confessional. Each of us must still ask ourselves the deep questions and confess where we, our household, our tribe, the house of Israel, has fallen short and contributed to the unnecessary suffering of innocents, who too reflect the very image of God. And that may be really, really hard to do those al-khaits. We may have to fess up to the al-khait of saying that loyalty to Israel means loyalty to a particular political party. We may have to admit the al-khait of intimidating pulpit rabbis for decades, that if they point out Israel's sins from the pulpit, such as the increasing settlement of the West Bank, they will be chastised with lashon hara, condescension, or veiled threats to their livelihood. For the al-khait of Israel's leadership, not to have been actively working toward a true and lasting peace, both for humanitarian reasons, and they should have been doing it for the sake of Israel's security. For the sin of hunting down terrorists while not showing any credible plan or strategy for rescuing hostages, or for a stable life and governance for Palestinians in Gaza, for the al-Khayd of paving the way thereby for potential opportunism by the racist factions within the Israeli government, who are crouching out the door to pounce. We may have to admit the sin of congregations that we haven't been supporting Israelis in our midst better. And the Israelis in our midst may have to admit that in America, where they reside, they've been finding feeble excuses for not joining synagogues. Because in Israel, you don't need to. For the sin of accepting the lie that Jews in America don't have a right to weigh in on Israel or to use political pressure to do so, when our fates are and always be intertwined as one people. It is these steps that will lead to dialogue and not to division. Let us not follow the false gods of ideology who promise us hope but hand us division. Let us accept the gift, the responsibility of Yom Kippur, bestowed on us with a kiss as a precious gift from our ancestors. The important thing, if we do the work, is not what will people think of us. It's what will we think of ourselves.